Last time, King Demetrius II had been slain in battle. The Seleucid kingdom had thereafter been usurped by the young Alexander Balas, who dubiously purported to be the long-lost son of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He had been politically and financially supported by a coalition of Rome, Cappadocia, Pergamon, and most prominently Egypt, who now as a result possessed enormous influence over the Seleucid Empire. The subordinate status of the empire to Egypt was displayed at the very beginning of Alexander's reign, when, in 150 BC, he was married to Cleopatra Thyia, the daughter of Ptolemy VI Philometor. If Alexander was genuinely of Seleucid blood, then this made Cleopatra his cousin, once removed. Rather than carrying out the nuptials in any of the great cities of Syria, the wedding instead took place at Ptolemais in Phoenicia. This choice of venue was symbolically important. The city had been refounded by Ptolemy I Soter back when Colle Syria had been an Egyptian possession and carried his name. It had also been where Alexander Balas first made land upon his invasion of the empire. The wedding was a grand and pompous affair. In attendance was Ptolemy VI, who brought with him a dowry of gold and silver, and Jonathan Aphus, the high priest of Judea, who was seated in a place of honour next to the king. It had only been 18 years earlier that Antiochus IV had occupied much of Egypt and had set up Ptolemy VI as a puppet ruler. Now it was the house of Ptolemy which was ascendant, having put its own puppet on the Seleucid throne. This Egyptian domination was also apparent in the bureaucratic appointments of Alexander. Two men with typically Egyptian names were placed in high office, with Ammonius being made chief minister, while a certain Hyrax governed Antioch, in conjunction with a Syrian named Diodorus. Antioch, which had served as the preeminent city of the empire and the seat of government for the past century, was pushed aside in favour of Ptolemais, possibly due to its relative proximity to Alexandria and the Ptolemaic court. For the Antiochian public, this meant a loss of prestige, as well as losing the financial activity associated with hosting the royal court. The dominance of Egypt was even reflected on the coinage, with an eagle regularly appearing on the obverse of Alexander's coins, mimicking the style of Ptolemaic currency. Young Alexander took full advantage of the riches and pleasures available to a king, having been previously unaccustomed to such things, spending much of his time within the confines of his palace, in the company of a harem of concubines. A particular episode in the life of the royal court has survived in the writings of the grammarian Athenaeus. One of the denizens of the court was an Epicurean philosopher named Diogenes, who hailed from Seleucia on the Tigris. Although Alexander generally preferred the Stoic school, this philosopher was a particular favourite of the king. Diogenes made a request of his patron that, as he considered himself to be the priest of virtue, he might wear the royal purple and a golden crown bearing the image of virtue in its centre. Alexander not only agreed to this, but awarded him the crown as a gift. However, Diogenes was of a fickle character, and soon gave these ornaments to an actress with whom he had become smitten. Word of this re-gifting came to the king, who subsequently arranged a great banquet of philosophers, to which he invited Diogenes. Once the feast had begun, Alexander inquired as to why the Epicurean was not wearing his fine robes and crown. Diogenes responded that such a thing would be unseemly. At this, Alexander signalled to his servants, who then brought in a group of musicians and performers. Prominently among them was the actress whom the philosopher loved, dressed up in his purple robes and golden crown. The audience became riotous with laughter, while the humiliated Diogenes sat in silence. Clearly, there was something of the bohemian spirit of Antiochus IV in the character of Alexander Balas. During the first years of his reign, it is likely, although not certain, that the king married off his sister, Laodice, to the newly crowned Mithridates V of Pontus, and she would later give birth to the future Mithridates VI, the famous Poison King. While Alexander enjoyed the fruits of his kingdom from his palace at Ptolemais, the rest of the realm was not without turmoil, with cities such as Marathus and Aradus engaging in private wars between each other. However, a much greater turmoil was soon to begin. The first stroke of disaster for King Alexander came in 149 or 148 BC, when the Parthians launched an invasion of the eastern provinces. It had now been over 6 decades since the rising power of the Parthians had been checked during the anabasis of Antiochus the Great. In the intervening years, the Parthian Empire had instead looked eastward, gradually swallowing up much of the Iranian plateau as the formerly mighty Greco-Bactrian kingdom entered its death throes. The Seleucids had not been ignorant to this growing threat, and Antiochus IV had set out east intent on dealing the Parthians another defeat, but had died before he could follow through with his planned invasion. Instead, the Parthians now came to the Seleucids, with King Mithridates the Great leading his men into the satrapy of Media. It seems that initially the Seleucid garrisons there provided fierce resistance, with Cleomenes, the governor of the upper satrapies, apparently having won a victory over the Parthians, as a statue of Heracles the Victorious was carved into the side of Mount Behistan in 148 BC, just southwest of the provincial capital of Ecbatana. This success was short-lived, however, as by 147 BC, Ecbatana itself, once the great capital of the empire of the Medes, had fallen to Mithridates, and with it, all of Media. Fortunately for Alexander, the Parthians did not press on further west, as Mithridates returned eastward, leaving his brother, Bagasus, to manage his new conquests. This eastern crisis was not yet over though, as with the collapse of Seleucid power in Media, the king of Elymais, Camnisceres II, invaded Susania and had taken control of Susa by 147 BC, thereafter adopting for himself the victorious epithet Nikephoros. Unlike his Parthian counterpart, the king did not stop there, but gradually continued to advance towards Babylonia. With Seleucid authority in the east rapidly unravelling, one may wonder why Alexander Balas had not raised an army to confront these invaders. The answer is simple. He was in the midst of his own fight for survival in the west. Demetrius Sota, prior to his death, had spirited away his elder 2 sons to Cnidos in Caria, so that the royal line may be kept secure, sending with them a substantial portion of the Seleucid treasury. While Alexander sat upon their father's throne, the 2 princes had been plotting their vengeance. Around 148 BC, the firstborn son, named Demetrius, who was about the age of 14, travelled to Crete. There, armed with a good deal of gold, he engaged the services of a substantial mercenary force, led by a captain named Lasthenes. The Cretans were well experienced in the ways of soldiery, but they also had a long reputation for greed, and saw in this venture many opportunities for profit. Knowledge of Demetrius's preparations would not have remained a secret, and would have spread not only to the ears of Alexander and his ministers, but also to the discontented masses across the Seleucid kingdom. A potentially unreliable excerpt from Malalas reports that Antioch was hit by an earthquake in 148 BC, which, if true, would have only caused further discontent against the incumbent regime, as the citizens may have viewed it as a sign of divine disapproval. In 147 BC, Demetrius and Lasthenes landed with their forces in Cilicia. This choice of location seems to have taken Alexander by surprise, as he was still in Ptolemais. Thus, the invaders were able to establish for themselves a substantial beachhead without any opposition. Upon learning of this, the Antiochian public began an uprising against their governors, Hierax and Diodorus, intending on delivering the city instead to Demetrius. Alexander immediately travelled north to quell the revolt in his capital and to confront the invaders, but as soon as he did, Apollonius Theos, the governor of Colle Syria, declared his support for Demetrius. A quick victory was now in sight, as the Cretans in Cilicia and the army of Colle Syria could converge in a vast pincer movement upon Syria itself. However, now the friend of the king, High Priest Jonathan Aphus, stepped in to defend the rule of Alexander, mustering the forces of Judea against those of Apollonius. 10,000 Jewish troops descended from the hills down to the coast and were met by a force of 8,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry on the plains outside Azotus. There, Jonathan Aphus and Simon Thassi inflicted a crushing defeat upon Apollonius. The remnants of his army scattered, with many fleeing into Azotus, where they took refuge inside the temple of the Philistine god Dagon. the Jewish forces set the whole city ablaze, and those sheltering within the temple were burnt alive. Between the battle and the fire, 8,000 soldiers had been killed. At a stroke, the southern front had been entirely eliminated, and as a show of his gratitude, Alexander sent a golden clasp to Jonathan, signifying that he was now his kinsman, and granted Judea control over the city of Acheron. Despite this victory, many of the veteran royal troops continued to defect to Demetrius, as they had served under his father, and so Alexander was unwilling to meet the invaders on the field of battle. Ptolemy VI, having learnt how close his puppet king had come to defeat, now chose to intervene in this conflict in order to protect his investment. The great royal army of Egypt crossed the Sinai unopposed and marched up the Levantine coast while the navy followed along by sea. Alexander gave orders that his father-in-law should be welcomed, so the cities of Colle, Syria opened their gates to Ptolemy, who then placed his own garrisons in each city which he came to. When the pharaoh came to Azotus, the survivors there showed him the devastation which the Jewish forces had caused, including the charred corpses which still lay in the smouldering ruins of the temple of Dagon. The citizens of Azotus demanded that the Jews be punished for their actions, but Ptolemy, who did not wish to alienate an ally in Jonathan, remained silent and did nothing. Upon reaching Jaffa, Ptolemy was met by the high priest and bestowed upon him gifts and honours. Jonathan travelled with the Egyptians until they reached the river Eleutheros, at which point he returned to Jerusalem. It was the Eleutheros which had formed the former border between Seleucid Syria and Egyptian Colle Syria, so it seems that the pharaoh intended to restore this ancient border, keeping all which he had taken in the Levant, and that Jonathan had consented to Egyptian suzerainty over Judea. It was while Ptolemy was in Ptolemais, where he had attended his daughter's wedding only a few years earlier, that an attempt to assassinate the pharaoh was made. While this plot was foiled, it still had significant consequences. The king alleged that the ringleader of the conspiracy against him was Ammonius, the chief minister of Alexander, and demanded that he be handed over for punishment. King Alexander refused to comply with this, thus making it appear as if he himself had at the very least acquiesced to the assassination attempt, perhaps fearing that Ptolemy sought to depose him. Thus an irreconcilable rift was opened between the two kings. Ptolemy immediately repudiated the alliance with Alexander and instead offered the hand of his daughter, Cleopatra, to Demetrius, in exchange for formally accepting Ptolemaic rule over Colle Syria. Demetrius, who had so far made little headway against Alexander, at once accepted this arrangement. Alexander now found himself again fighting a war on two fronts, but this time he was entirely devoid of allies. Desiring to eliminate at least one of his enemies, the king led his forces out of Syria and into Cilicia, seeking battle with Demetrius. As a precautionary measure, Alexander sent his child son, Antiochus, to a place in northern Syria named Abai, to be kept safe by Yamlek, an Arab sheikh. With Alexander gone and with the Ptolemaic army having entered Syria, the governors of Antioch, Hyrax and Diodorus, who had already survived one uprising, saw which way the wind was blowing, and initiated a rebellion of their own with the people of the city against Ammonius. This proved to be a total success, with Ammonius being killed by the mob as he tried to flee the city disguised as a woman. The gates of Antioch were now flung open to Ptolemy, who entered the Seleucid capital to the adulation of its citizens. Hyrax and Diodorus, together with the Antiochene public at large, offered a diadem to Ptolemy, urging him to accept the kingship of the empire. At last, the pharaoh had arrived at the heights of greatness. In his younger days, he had served as nothing more than the puppet of Antiochus IV, and later had been deposed altogether, being reduced to begging the Roman Senate for aid while dressed in rags. Now Ptolemy was being offered the opportunity to extend his realm to its greatest extent, an empire stretching from the cataracts of the Upper Nile to the canals of Babylonia. However, much as Antiochus IV had refused to annex Egypt for the fear of alienating Rome, Ptolemy now declined the crown of Syria. Not only would a combined Ptolemaic Seleucid realm mean threatening Roman power, but in the immediate, it would force the Egyptians to fight both Alexander and Demetrius simultaneously in a foreign land with already strained supply lines. Instead, Ptolemy addressed the city assembly, and after promising that the pharaoh would provide counsel to the new king, and that there would be no reprisals for the deposition of Demetrius Soter, they agreed to accept the younger Demetrius as their ruler. Better to secure Colle Syria and have a grateful and dependent ally in Antioch, rather than to risk losing it all. In 145 BC, having for now avoided a decisive battle with Alexander Balas, Demetrius came to Antioch, where he was married to Cleopatra Thyia and was crowned. His regnal epithet was borrowed from Seleucus I himself, being known to us as Demetrius II Nicator. With his authority crumbling, Alexander now went for broke and crossed back into Syria, where he began pillaging the lands around Antioch, hoping to provoke his enemies into meeting him in the field in a desperate attempt to snatch a miraculous victory from the jaws of defeat. No such miracle was to take place, and on the banks of the river Onoparis, Alexander's army, and with it his hopes, were annihilated. Despite this decisive victory, the fates had played a cruel trick on the hitherto ascendant house of Ptolemy. In the heat of battle, the pharaoh's horse was spooked by the trumpet of an elephant and threw its master to the ground. There, soldiers of Alexander fell upon Ptolemy, inflicting a great many wounds upon him, including a severe fracture to his skull. The king was rescued by his bodyguards, but after the battle fell into a coma. Meanwhile, Alexander Balas had fled with 500 survivors to Abai, where he had earlier sent his son. There, two of his officers, Heliades and Cassius, betrayed their leader, and along with an Arab sheikh named Zebalus, slew him. Alexander's head was delivered to Ptolemy 5 days after the battle. The pharaoh had briefly awoken and recovered his wits long enough to witness the deathly countenance of his former son-in-law. It would be the last thing he would see, as he would soon die when surgeons attempted to trepan his skull. There is little which can be said in favour of Alexander Balas. He accomplished next to nothing, only overseeing the devouring of his kingdom from the east, then the west, and eventually the south. Some have defended the character of Alexander, claiming that the surviving sources are biased against him, which may well be the case, but then there are no ancient sources in praise of the king. Uniformly, he is described as being indolent and unfit to rule, and the fruits of his reign support this view. The public discontent against him, the defection of his troops to Demetrius, and the dissolution of the alliance with Ptolemy. The one positive may be the general peace in Judea, but then this came by ending all attempts to advance Hellenization in that province. We do not know Alexander's precise age, but he would have been no more than 25 years old and had reigned for about 5 years. What a fortuitous turn of events for Demetrius Nicator. Not only had his chief rival to the throne been murdered, but his effective overlord in Ptolemy had also succumbed. In Alexandria there was confusion over the succession. Ptolemy VI had left an infant son, but his estranged brother, Ptolemy Physcon, who ruled in Kyrene, was invited to claim the throne. Through the ensuing power struggle, all concerns over Syria were forgotten. Demetrius and his Cretan allies, led by Lasthenes, took full advantage of this situation, repudiating the alliance with Egypt. The Ptolemaic army, now rudderless, scattered and fled, while their elephant corps was seized. Throughout Colle Syria, the local populations rose up and exterminated their Egyptian garrisons. In short order, without a battle being fought, Colle Syria was rejoined to the Seleucid Empire. Ptolemy VI's legacy had been undone in an instant. There was immediate resistance against Demetrius II in only one part of the empire, Judea. Jonathan Aphus had been a supporter of Alexander, then Ptolemy, and before that had been an enemy of Demetrius I, so it is understandable that he would not be in favour of this new status quo. Jewish forces began a siege of the Acra fortress in Jerusalem. An envoy from the Seleucid garrison slipped through the siege cordon and informed the king of what was happening. Demetrius at once left Antioch, and upon arriving at Ptolemais he summoned Jonathan to meet with him. The high priest and his retinue met with the king, presenting to him gold, silver, fine garments, and other such rich gifts. This softened the heart of Demetrius, and a new settlement over Judea was negotiated. Jonathan Aphus was confirmed in his office. Taxation for all Judea was reduced to a flat amount of 300 talents, and 3 districts of Samaria were placed under the control of Judea. In exchange for these concessions, Jonathan agreed to support the king, and the siege of the Acra was lifted. In the east of the empire, the situation had continued to deteriorate, and by 145 BC, Cambyses II was now threatening Babylonia itself. While Demetrius was not yet sufficiently secure in his rule in the west to turn east and retake the territories there, which had been lost under Alexander, he did send orders to confront this interloper. The governor of Babylonia, Ardea, raised an army from the local population and marched out to battle Cambyses. The outcome of this campaign is vague and unclear. On one hand, coins of Demetrius II were minted in Susa in 145 BC, but on the other hand, the surviving fragments of the Babylonian astronomical diaries suggest that Cambyses successfully raided Babylonia. In any case, no further Seleucid territory seems to have been lost at this time. It is important to keep in mind that Demetrius was at present only about 16 years of age, and as such the real power in government lay with Lasthenes and his Cretan mercenaries. Now that there was peace in the west of the empire, Demetrius dismissed his army, including those veteran troops who had defected to his side, with the money that would have gone to pay the wages of these soldiers being redirected instead to this Praetorian Guard of foreign mercenaries. This sudden state of unemployment had the predictable effect of creating a large amount of discontent against the king in the formerly loyal ranks of the soldiery. Across the land, but particularly in Antioch, the Cretans began carrying out proscriptions against those who had been supporters of Alexander, executing them and seizing their property, in direct contravention of the guarantees which Ptolemy VI had made. This caused the citizens of Antioch to once again take up arms and rise up against their liege. The Antiochene mob had by now become a potent political force within the empire, having played a role in the downfall of the last 3 kings of Syria. The Cretans demanded that the mob lay down their arms, but this ultimatum was refused. The result was violence, with the mercenaries cutting down many of these protesters and subsequently searching out and murdering the families of their victims. This only exacerbated the situation, and in short order the city was in a state of all-out war between the Cretans and the mob. In the midst of all this turbulence, Demetrius requested aid from Judea, offering in exchange to withdraw all remaining Seleucid garrisons from the region, and so Jonathan dispatched a force of 3,000 Maccabean troops to help defend the royal palace. The mob had now grown to a vast size and had besieged the palace, blockading all of its exits in an effort to get their hands on the king. The Cretans barely held the gates against the crowd, while the Jewish troops, positioned on the palace roof, rained down missiles into the throng of people. The wooden buildings directly adjacent to the palace were soon set alight, with the fire rapidly spreading through the narrow streets of the city. The Antiochenes fled in terror, making a desperate attempt to save their property, family, and lives. One can only imagine how many were crushed to death in the ensuing stampede. Pursuit was made on foot by the Cretans, while the Jews gave chase by leaping from rooftop to rooftop, thus staying out of reach of the mob. According to the first book of Maccabees, the Jewish contingent alone slaughtered 100,000 men. At the end of the day, the rebellion had been quashed, with the survivors either surrendering or fleeing for their lives into the countryside. Antioch, that great seat of empire which had been built up and glorified by successive kings, was now in large part a smouldering ruin, polluted by the stench of death. Demetrius greatly praised his Jewish allies for their aid, and as a way of thanks allowed them to plunder the city, spoils of which they carried off back to Jerusalem. The kingship of Demetrius had survived its first challenge, but his method of achieving this was so monstrous the people of Syria would forever bear enmity against him. Next time, the disaffected military classes will launch an organised rebellion against the tyranny of Demetrius. If you have any comments, criticism, or questions, please post them below, and thank you for listening.